Dying with dignity or dying too soon?
It's time for the public to have their say on euthanasia legislation after it passed its first reading.
Hello and welcome to tonight's debate on the end-of-life choice bill. Now, in 2 weeks' time, you're going to be asked to decide whether you want to legalise euthanasia for people who are terminally ill with a life expectancy of less than 6 months. And with me tonight to debate this is Stuart Armstrong, who is suffering from terminal cancer, Dr Mary English, specialist GP from Wellington, Dr John Bunning, emergency specialist at Waikato Hospital, and Professor Rod McCloud, clinical director at Hospice New Zealand. I'm really looking forward to hearing all of your views on this, and thank you so much all for joining me. Before we get into this, I'd like to give each of you the time for a brief elevator pitch to explain where you stand on the issue. And if I could, I'll start with you, Stuart Armstrong.
So to be able to choose a time, and I've got this in my own mind, of dying on horseback, impractical as that sounds, and with my wife alongside me and my friends after a bonfire, having some good music, having a bit of a party, then that's how I want to do. I don't want to be curled up in some miserable hospital bed while the morphine gets amped up. That's just not for me. Okay. Dr Mary English.
Kia ora, Katalofa. Last week, one of my colleagues told me about a home visit with a very sick patient of his. He got there and the husband of patient A, that's what I'll call his wife, told him that she was suffering, she wanted to die, and what was he going to do about it? He sat down with the patient and he tried to have a conversation with her, but she wouldn't say anything. As he was leaving the property, he bumped into her daughter, who said to him, "My mother is in an abusive relationship. She doesn't want to die, but she will never stand up to him or tell him." Unfortunately, there are many families like this in New Zealand, and we as doctors know that. This legislation will not protect patient A. It's unsafe, it's risky, and we need to unite against it and vote against it.
That's nonsense.
All right, Mary, thank you. And Stuart, you will get your opportunity to rebut. Dr John Bunning.
Thank you very much. Kia ora katoa. We're here to debate the end-of-life choice bill, referendum, the key word there being choice. And whilst there are those who oppose the end-of-life choice bill and they call themselves pro-life, in fact, those of us that support it call ourselves pro-choice. So it's about respect for people's autonomy and dignity, about easing suffering and informed choice. I have respect for those who wish to take up the contrary view, a contrary standpoint to this issue. I respect the choices they're making for themselves. However, I do take issue with them wishing to make or control my choices for me and a significant number of the New Zealanders who support this bill. I do not necessarily wish to change the views of those who have fully made their minds up against end-of-life choice. However, I do wish to dispel myths about doctors' attitudes to the end-of-life choice bill and voluntary assisted dying, and would hope to persuade those who are as yet undecided, who perhaps have been misinformed. Despite what some organisations and institutions wish to say, there's a significant number of New Zealanders, and in particular doctors, across a wide spectrum of specialties who support this legislation. At the moment, people have no choice. A few suffer, and the end is not always easy. The end-of-life choice is by no means for everyone. However, it is something that some people need. An international experience has shown that it is embraced by numerous countries. In particular, relevance to us is our neighbours in Victoria, Australia, where the law has been embraced, the vulnerable are not targeted, suicides do not increase, and trust in doctors is enhanced rather than eroded. I have the Victorian statistics for the first 12 months of their Act from June of 2019 to June 2020, and the statements in that report are very clear. Voluntary assisted dying is about informed personal choice with good checks and balances, and they have control and they're maintaining dignity in death.
John, thanks so much. And finally, Professor Rod McCloud.
Well, I think that we're all here really for the same reason, that we want to ensure that we continue to have a compassionate community that values life before death. I've practiced specialist palliative care for over 30 years, and I think I can honestly say that I have yet to meet somebody who I thought would be better off dead. The difficulty with this so-called End-of-Life Choice Act, and we need to remember that it is an act, is presented really as a flawed piece of legislation, in that it doesn't contain nearly enough safeguards to ensure we keep the most vulnerable people in our society safe. There's no real test for coercion. There's no simple test of mental competence. There's no requirement to discuss the issues with family members. No guarantee that your doctor can make an accurate prognosis even. In addition, we've heard practically nothing about the potential effects on families in the event of somebody choosing assisted dying without their knowledge. Neither have we heard of the potential effects of ending a life on doctors and nurses who will have to do it. So it's no surprise, therefore, that those who are involved with providing end-of-life care are, in a majority, opposed to this act.
All right. Thank you very much. Thank you all for your pitches there. Stu, can I start with you on this? Now, you have spoken about the fact that you are living, with cancer, and you are going to die. Mm-hmm. Are you scared of dying?
I get asked it a little bit, actually, from folk, and I'm not, as it happens. I was nervous about dying miserably, but thankfully, with the support of all the compassionate people in New Zealand, this referendum's going to pass. And that makes me feel a hell of a lot better. And I know that on overseas experience that those that are studied actually live a bit longer, based on countries like the Netherlands and Belgium, Oregon's been around for 20 years. These folk in my position actually live longer just knowing that this comfort is there for them at the end should they choose it. And if I don't mind rebutting what Rod had to say there are no doctors that have to do this. Doctors can conscientiously object, so I'm not quite sure which law he's talking about.
What's your prognosis? How long have you got?
My wife and I had this discussion about whether we find out or not. Mine's prostate cancer that has metastasised or spread through to my skeleton, as it does with prostate cancer, and was 6 years ago in May, and so I've made it this long, but I think the bell curve, as I was explained by my oncologist, is around the sort of 4 to 5 year mark. So I'm at 6 years. I'm pretty happy. I've done well. I got to see my 60th birthday, which seemed a hell of a long way off back then. So,
Stu, when it happens, right, when your time comes,
yeah.
I'm not really sure how to ask this question, but is it an easy death or is it not?
I don't know. When you say is it an easy death, I don't know if anyone's death's easy as such, but I go.
You know what I mean?
Well, I do. I mean, I'm happy to. I'm not happy to go at all. I want to live forever, actually, damn it. But bearing in mind we're all going to die, I want to have a death that sort of more reflects the way I've lived my life, and that's full of energy and enthusiasm and love for life. And I'll be blowed if I'll be stuck in some hospital bed while that happens. I want a death with dignity on my terms and my sort of spirituality, if you like, which is why I mentioned the horses and everything. I mean, that's been my life with my very loving and supportive wife and family, and they want that too. They want me to grab every single minute I can.
So Rod and Mary, both of you are opposed, obviously, to euthanasia. How if somebody like Stu is telling you that he would like to be able to die in a way of his own choosing rather than going in what could potentially be a really difficult way to die? Rod, I want to start with you and I'll come to you on this, Mary. How can you tell him he can't? He can't have that choice.
We're not actually debating whether or not euthanasia is a good idea. What we're debating is this particular piece of legislation. And I think the difficulty with this legislation is that it's been poorly thought out and came through the parliamentary process with very little changes to what it was originally.
So what about it do you object to?
Well, I object to the fact that in the legislation, the doctor is expected to do their best, quote unquote, to detect coercion.
Okay.
Now, I think that's a real challenge.
We will come to all of these things, and it's absolutely fair to raise your concerns about this bill. But euthanasia in and of itself, the concept that somebody like Stu can choose when they die, do you have a problem with that?
Well, yes, I do, because, as I said, I've worked in palliative care for 30 years, and I've had a lot of people who've asked me if I could end their life, would I do it there and then? And that's very common when people get referred to a palliative care service initially, because they come with a sense of hopelessness, a sense of fear, a sense of anxiety, and the sort of rhetoric that goes around the idea of a painful death is very real, and that's one of the things that people are frightened of. But with a palliative care team providing support for the patient and the family, those fears and anxieties can be sometimes completely removed.
Okay.
Not always, but sometimes.
Okay, and we will discuss that a little bit further. Mary, what do you say to somebody like Stu who would like to be able to choose?
Well, we again are focusing on this law, which is going to be voted on.
Yes.
And it's about the balances between choice and autonomy, but that can't go uncensored without also the balance of protecting the vulnerable, which is the elderly, the ill, the disabled, and those who are dying.
But the elderly, the ill, the ill are included here, but the elderly and the disabled are not. That's not an option for them, is it?
Well, that's not that clear in terms of the option. We've listened to Paula Tesoriero, the Disability Commissioner. She says that there is no bright line. There is often an overlap. Patients don't come in neat boxes. Disabled, not dying. There's often a merge. So there is an overlap. Also with the elderly and the infirm and the disabled, they don't have a choice. The elderly don't have a choice about getting old, and they certainly don't have a choice about elder abuse.
Although I do feel obliged to say that this legislation does not allow somebody who just feels that they're getting too old to make this decision. John, I want to come to you on this. You have had a number of family members, am I right?
I have, yes.
Who have died deaths.
I've seen a lot of people, including close family members, that have suffered at the end of their life, despite the best health care, loving families surrounding them. They're clearly at the end of their life. I've had colleagues, one recently in Western Australia who died of mesothelioma, specialist emergency physician. He knew exactly what was going on, and he wrote a poignant blog in the last days of his life as he waited for that inevitable death. What was it going to be? Was he going to sort of suddenly hemorrhage into his lungs? Was he going to need just to be amped up on the morphine until he stopped breathing? There was just so much uncertainty. And he says, this isn't what we wanted. We wait for that inevitable end, and it's truly inevitable. I do think that it's quite clear. There are 45 requirements in this legislation. It's going to be the most rigorous in the world, and at some point I do want to talk about how it works so well elsewhere around the world. The Canadians and Victoria, Australia, it works beautifully over there, and I've got some wonderful anecdotes and stories and the data from Victoria if there's time for that.
All right, absolutely. We will make time for that. Let's take a break. It's 7:19 on News Talk ZB. After that, we're going to talk a little bit about the practical side of things. If we decide that it is okay for someone to end their life, how's it going to work? All right, it's 7:22. Welcome back. Something that's not set down in the End of Life Choice Bill is the way in which people would end their life if they were able to. It can be done by a doctor or by the person who is dying. So let's get a little bit of information on this. Rod, I want to start with you. How would it work? The mechanics of the thing.
Well, my understanding is that the patient has some choices. They can either administer the drug themselves by pushing an injection or by swallowing something, or it can be put down a nasogastric tube, or the doctor or a nurse practitioner can administer the drugs. We haven't been told what the drugs are, but I would imagine that they are a combination of muscle relaxants, anesthetics, and sedatives, much in the same way that, as I understand it, happens in Victoria.
And so how long would they take to work?
Well, that's a very difficult question, because I think there is an assumption that euthanasia is like flicking a switch. And a lot of the time it is. It works within minutes, or certainly a few minutes, but occasionally it takes longer. And there are reports from Oregon, and I don't know what drugs they use in Oregon, but there are reports from Oregon where it hasn't worked at all, or somebody's vomited the drug up, or they've had a convulsion. So it's not quite as simple as just giving a jab and somebody dies. That's what we would like to think would happen, but there's no guarantee of that.
Yeah. Okay, now, John, you've spoken a lot about the fact that you are across what happens in Victoria. Have you seen these reports? That sometimes
Indeed.
It doesn't work?
I've got the report from June 2019 to June 2020. The numbers, just briefly, there was 630 people found eligible through to 230 permits. A number of people died before taking it, and it's not like you get the permit and then immediately take the decision. And in fact, there are 124 people over 12 months in Victoria that took this course of action. 104 of them administer the medication themselves, so oral tablets, and only 20 of them required the health practitioner to give them. And there are just some wonderful quotes from there. It was a beautiful passing. He told a joke before taking the medication, then followed with a glass of port. It was the way he wanted to go. It was a beautiful and peaceful death. It was absolutely pleasant and calm process, which gave me so much relief to see her serenely. And again, you hear stories of people that were initially sceptical that, in fact, turned around and said, actually, this was a good thing. So there's not been any bad stories come out of Victoria near us. In Canada as well, I've heard, I haven't got the data on Canada, but it's there's 150 million people in countries around the world that use it successfully. There is no slippery slope. There is no coercion, or very, very little, none that I've heard of, no evidence of. And no country has rescinded this legislation.
John, I want to stay with you on this. Rod mentioned earlier that actually what we should be doing is we should be rolling out a palliative care system in this country so that you don't have to be faced with the choice of a death that is painful. I mean, would that solve the problem?
It wouldn't solve the problem. I absolutely agree that we need a strong palliative care system in this country, and this must go hand in hand with a strong palliative care system. It cannot be separate, and it is absolutely crucial that we have that. But even with the best care in the world, there are conditions and suffering that cannot be eased in a number of conditions. My wife's father's second partner, my wife's mother and the father's second partner both died of cancer. The second one, this was in Sweden, surrounded by people she loved with the best care in the world. I remember we were sitting there talking to her, and she was in such pain. She said even the sheet on her body in bed was painful. So there's a small percentage of people, and it is a small percentage.
Is it?
2 to 5%, probably.
2 to 5% who you just cannot do anything
you
for.
Can't. The symptoms have got so bad.
No, I think the report out of Palliative Care Australia have looked into that. And you're right, the 2 to 5% have uncontrolled symptoms at the start of their terminal phase. But that's at the start. And the thing about pain relief is that you can manage pain. You can't always take it away, but you can certainly change it. And the thing that drives people mad is pain that's relentless, and it just won't change. And I think what palliative care can do is to change the pain. I can't put my hand on my heart and say, I will take away everybody's pain. That would be nonsense. The other thing to remember about pain is that, and we talked a little bit about suffering earlier on, we can't take away all suffering either. Because I know if I'm dying, part of my suffering will be that I won't be able to hold my wife or see my grandchildren reach their full potential. That's an element of suffering which for some people is enormous. It really is enormous.
But it's not the same sort of suffering that we're talking about.
Well,
it's not just about pain as well. Remember,
No, it's not.
It's about ascites. It's about fluid collections on your body.
Yeah.
It's about hemorrhaging to death. About not being able to swallow, not being able to eat, intractable nausea. And again, palliative care is tremendously important here. I completely agree.
But coming back to this legislation, one of the criteria is about unendurable suffering. And that doesn't have to be physical. And Rod's quite right. The emotional and psychological is just as valid. And there will be New Zealanders, if this law goes through, who will be euthanised for those reasons.
But if
What's wrong with that?
Be euthanised. Sorry, this is a choice. They're not going to be euthanised. They're choosing to go.
Well, they will be. They will be if they fulfil the criteria.
Sorry, you're going to talk over me. I didn't talk over you. The point you're making in terms of the 2, 3, 5%. This affects me greatly. This is ballpark stuff for me. They're the best palliative care in the world, and I believe qualitative research has been done at our New Zealand Palliative Care Service, and we rate third in the world. Fantastic. But even many representatives of palliative care, clearly not you, have said, look, there are folk in that 2 to 5% that actually the suffering that they go through cannot be remediated by traditional palliative care. This is what this act is for. So for goodness sake, realise it. You're not perfect. Let's help these people avoid this suffering. You're trying to stop it. It's crazy. Show some compassion, man.
But with regards to this law, I read the report from Victoria. They have 67 safeguards. We've had QCs look at this in New Zealand, look at the one that we're actually voting on the 17th of October, and they say there are little to no safeguards. And if we come back to the first one around coercion, in terms, no, there aren't, because none of them are enforceable.
Oh, excuse me, but you said QCs. Now, in our country, we have somebody called the Attorney General. Now, the Attorney General, having gone through all of this parliamentary process, gets to sign off this law as safe and actually as constitutionally correct. He's done that already. Are you querying our Attorney General on legalities?
Give me a break. What I'm saying is that the safeguards are not there. All that a doctor has to do with regards...
Have you read this bill?
If I could have a go now. In terms of coercion, all the doctor has to do is to do their best, whatever that means. What they are absolutely required to do is to tell the patient that they are under no obligation to talk to someone else about it. Now, that someone else could be the mother or father of an 18-year-old and who is terminally ill. And the first that those parents might get to know about this is if they get a phone call or a death certificate coming to them. And that's something that no parent wants.
Oh, gosh, so within 6 months of death, suddenly an 18-year-old is going to be within 6 months of death. That's nonsense, Mary. You're talking about 0.00.
No, that's not true.
That will terrify. That will
That's not
terrify
true.
a lot of parents. John, is that the case? That could possibly happen?
So there are 45 different requirements, and
What are you going to do about that
18-year-olds
one? What are you going to do about the 18-year-old? We know from
with a terminal illness that's got intolerable suffering
Absolutely.
that's going to die.
Absolutely.
They're allowed to vote. They're allowed to do everything. They're allowed to make their own
They're
choices.
also part of families. They're also part of whānau. They're also
course
part of
they are.
ainga.
Sure.
And
What's your point?
actually, why would we want to enshrine in legislation the opportunity for families like that to suffer? We know from the neuroscientists around development, brain development, that the prefrontal cortex, which, as you guys will know, is the centre for making decisions, that is barely fully matured by the age of 25. So you're saying, yes, that's fine, they can vote and do all these other things, but people are not by themselves, they're not in a vacuum. We operate in communities and families, and we should not be creating
We're
laws that
talking about
enable
unicorns
parents to be
unicorns
treated
here.
like
So the
that.
Australia's the 37 to 100 was the age range in Victoria. The average age 71. There is not going to be a truckload of 18-year-olds.
It's not about the numbers. I would say
it kind
just
of is.
one. I
Yeah.
would just say one situation like that would be a bad
But you can't
situation.
legislate for one exception. You've got to legislate for the masses. And it's about dignity and autonomy for people to make informed choice.
But it's also about legislating for the protections for the vulnerable. We've
Exactly,
got
which is
autonomy.
why this law is
Where
such
are
a
the
good one. I'm
protections?
so pleased this is into. You carry on.
We
sorry.
park paternalistic medicine where the doctor knows right and the doctor tells people what to do. No, you give them information to make an informed choice. And yes, you do that
So
for
you don't
18-year-olds.
care about coercion of the elderly.
Of course I care about coercion.
Good Lord.
You think it's good enough to say that a doctor who just does their best is enough and that will do?
Well, I hope we do our best with every single patient.
We
for every
would
single
hope that it would
condition
be
we
a
treat.
requirement that the doctor would be able to talk to whoever wants to talk to them from the family.
Well,
They only
the
allow
privacy law,
the
you can't.
patient.
It's up to the patient whether
Well,
you talk to
that's
other
what
people.
That's what this
the law's
legislation is saying.
And that's the real difficulty, in my view, that we all live. Well, most of us live within a family construct.
Yep.
And
We're not islands.
No, we're not islands. And I think one of the things that I find most difficult about this law, I mean, there are a number of things, obviously, but the idea that nobody can talk to the rest of the family about it, because coercion is real. I've stood outside people's rooms
Absolutely.
listening to families saying, "Oh God, I wish he'd go. We've got to get back to
Rob,
San
what would be
Francisco."
the benefit in talking to the rest of the family to allow the doctor to establish that they are coercing this
Yeah.
person?
Well, that's what
And a doctor is equipped to establish that?
Well, I think
Well, it's very
and remember,
difficult.
there's three
In the medical
doctors.
council, we're relying on a doctor to do this and doing something vague like doing their best. And even the Royal College of GPs, the largest college in New Zealand, my college, has said that that is totally unrealistic.
Yes, but the Royal New
You're
Zealand
relying on
College of
one
GPs
doctor.
is neutral on this issue. They have not taken opinion. It's an individual
Well,
conscious
they may
issue,
or
like
may
the
not
College
be
of
neutral, but
Physicians
they're
in the
absolutely
UK.
right about one
There
of the
are lots of
cornerstone
doctors.
protections is that we do not have people coerced who did not want to die. Like patient A was very vulnerable and
It
she would
has
be a
not
prime sitter.
happened in these other jurisdictions. It doesn't
John,
happen
I have a
in
text
Canada.
for you. It says, Dr. John Bunning is wrong to compare this law with Victoria's, which is much more restrictive.
Absolutely.
3 examples of the need for 2 witnesses, a cooling off period of 9 days and a specialist medical requirement. None of these safeguards are present in the New Zealand law.
yes, that's right.
No, they're not.
They're
They're
not.
absolutely
Cooling off
not.
period of 2
No, they are
days,
not.
isn't it?
20.
It's not going to happen in 2 days with the consultations that need to occur.
Well, the Ministry have said
nonsense.
4. And there's no real cooling off period. There's no witnesses to this act.
You're
There's no
saying,
witnesses.
you're saying there
requirement of
doesn't have
reports.
to be a cooling off
There's-
period. We're saying that with the individual patient, it's their choice. That if you're 18 years of age, you can go off and fight in the war. You can make all of these decisions because you are an adult. You're going to deny them. You're going to say, well, this 18-year-old's not sufficient because something. I think Mary rambled about some prefrontal cortex. Listen, you're doing a disservice to your own GP practitioners as well. I've dealt with
stating
GPs
a
over
fact,
10
Stuart. I'm stating a fact.
years. I spoke to GPs every day of my working life. And not one of those, the 650 of them that I spoke to every day.
So you would say that...
Excuse me, let me finish this. And not one of those people I have anything than complete and utter respect for. They made great decisions. They were looking after their patients as best they could. And I think you're doing them a grave disservice with this nonsense.
But I have great respect for someone of the stature of Professor Hinemoa Elder, who knows a lot about this, and that was a point that she brought up, and it's a very legitimate point. Also, may I say that in May of last year, there was a Curia poll of New Zealanders. 70% of them said that they did not want to have it. They thought it was wrong that 18-year-olds would be able to proceed with a lethal dose, with having a lethal dose administered to them without others
you'd be disappointed.
You'd be
disappointed to know about the 20 years of research that's been done in this country, polling people, not just one little cherry-picked research. 20 years,
I think that's
New
quite
Zealand
compelling,
have
and
been.
it's quite
20
sensible.
years, people have been deciding that about 65 to 75% are in favour of a legislation very similar to this, and it is, by the way, despite your misinformation and fear-mongering, one of the most restrictive laws in the world to date.
No, it's absolutely not. You're wrong about that.
75% or so of New Zealanders want to do this, so I'm confident
No,
here
you're
that it's
wrong
going to
about
happen.
that, Stuart.
I
Okay,
beg your
it's
pardon?
very liberal.
It's not so.
I'd like to actually hear
Nonsense.
why this is not one of the most restrictive pieces of legislation. But I tell you what, we'll do this after the break. We'll just take a quick break. It's 25 to 8 here on News Talk ZB. You are with the euthanasia debate. Back with you in just a ticky.
I'm against euthanasia. I believe that everyone has a right to live, and that we shouldn't give that right to experts or like people who, like doctors, to determine whether we should live or not, and that we should take care of those who don't. Yeah.
I'm voting for it. I believe that people should have a right to decide when their life ends, especially if they're enduring a great amount of pain, and also draining the family of all their resources and energies to care for them. So I do believe it's best if someone would be able to decide whether they want to pass or not. I've seen loved ones that I've known personally who've suffered a great deal of pain and had no other choice but to sit there and keep enduring it day in, day out, even when they wanted to go and they depleted all of their savings as well as the savings they intended to leave for their families, for their health. And had this referendum existed when that was happening, it would have been avoided.
For it. I think in the reduced circumstances in which the bill allows people to have assisted dying, it's absolutely right that they should have the ability to die with dignity.
I haven't really heard much about it, so I don't have much understanding of it. Yeah, I think more information would be handy, because I think there's a lot of people that are standing there and don't really know what to say because they haven't had the information given to them. So I guess with all the COVID that's going on and everything, there's a few more things that are a bit more vital at the moment, I guess.
No, I'm all for it, because like if someone gets to that point in their life and they don't want to deal with illness and stuff like that, then it should be up to them what they do.
Yeah, I'm kind of in the same boat. I think if someone gets to the stage where they've got a terminal illness or something like that, and they're mentally sound to make that decision that they don't want to live with that for the rest of their life, or they've gotten to the point in their life where it's too hard to live with or cope with, I think that there shouldn't be a problem with people choosing a nicer way to go rather than letting their illness kill them.
Right, well, welcome back. It's 22 to 8 and you're with the euthanasia debate. Stuart Armstrong, Dr. Mary English, Dr. John Bunning and Professor Rod McCloud and myself, Heather Duplessis-Allen. So where we left it off just before the last break, Mary, is that there was a debate about whether this is a tough piece of legislation in contrast to what we see around the world. What do you say?
I'd say it's not.
Not particularly restrictive?
No, not at all. I've had QCs look at this and they tell me that the safeguards are very weak. Certainly nothing like what they've got in Victoria, where they can list 67. But most importantly, what we've got here is legislation where really nothing can be enforced. We think that we can send things to the registrar, and the registrar will be somebody that will be able to do something, but actually that person, this is the registrar who gets the forms once the two doctors who've signed off have done it all. And all that person has the power to do really is to make sure the forms are all properly filled out and send them on to the report committee. What that person cannot do is they have no powers to investigate. They cannot move to do anything to protect. They do not have a duty of protection for a patient for whom there is a question around coercion. They cannot ask for more information. They're very weak powers.
Mary, I know that you're concerned about coercion, and I think we all should be, obviously. But what could we realistically do? The safeguards require the doctor to talk to the patient, and I can't see beyond actually having conversations. You could do much more to establish coercion.
Well, that question is irrelevant because, as I say, this law is ready to go. There's nothing that I or anyone else could possibly add to it.
But what I'm asking is, if this has a deficiency in it, how would you repair it? What is the alternative?
The thing is, I can't repair it because I'm not in a position to do so. All I can do is say to people listening to this program...
What do other jurisdictions do?
Well, other jurisdictions will have some of the things that Rod was talking about before, like the calling off period, like requiring patients to perhaps have a psychiatric assessment.
There's
that's
in our legislation,
No,
assessment?
the only time that a psychiatrist will pop their head up is if the two doctors do not agree with regards to capacity. And the only question around capacity that has to be answered is, does this person understand that when they get the lethal injection that they are going to die? There's nothing in here about suicide prevention or intervention.
And there's nothing about...
It's not suicide,
about
Mary.
depressive illness either. I think that's another worry that I have, is that there's very little in this Act that goes anyway to helping doctors decide whether or not somebody has a depressive illness. Now,
absolutely,
the symptoms of a depressive illness are very similar to the symptoms of somebody who's dying, in that they might be losing weight, they might be losing their appetite.
But this person will regardless be dying.
Yes.
Yes.
But if they're depressed, then they don't qualify for assisted dying, according to this Act.
And so you're saying it's impossible to separate
I think it's very
the depression
difficult.
from...
And psychiatrists in this country
Absolutely.
have specifically said that it's very difficult to make that diagnosis.
Of course it is. I mean, you clearly have a very poor opinion of a lot of the doctors in New Zealand, the ones that are going to be coming in on this legislation. There will be training, and it'll be a small number initially, and it'll grow as it has done in Australia. We're trained to do this, to look for, and sure, it can be subtle.
Yes, but if psychiatrists can say that they find it difficult to diagnose depression in people who are near the end of life, then the doctors in training, however good they might be, are also going to find it difficult.
So would this situation be mirrored in, say, the closest that we have to this law, bringing it back to what's happening overseas, which was your original point, I think, Heather, in Oregon, which has, again, like ours, the 6 months terminal illness diagnosis. It's the closest we've got. It's been going for 20 years.
And the Netherlands as well.
These are jurisdictions that are very similar to us. I think the Netherlands and Belgium are certainly more liberal. But 20 years of the same sort of legislation without psychiatrists or GPs being struck off all over the show, or patients complaining about just nonsense.
There's no evidence of coercion.
No, that's absolutely wrong. We had Theo Boer out recently. He is the doctor from the Netherlands who had been, and this is one of the things that they had that we don't have, is they actually get all the notes and records after a patient's been euthanised and go through them and review them. He had done it for 10 years, and he felt that our system and what the safeguards that were proposed were very lax. Because that's not required. There is no evidence or reporting required other than did Doctor 1 and Doctor 2 fix? No, absolutely not. All there is are the forms filled out, and has the patient signed it, and has it gone to the registrar, and that's pretty much it. There is no review of cases,
Mary, but
like there is in the
I've
Netherlands.
listened to Professor Jan Bernheim, who actually designed and helped implement the laws in Belgium and the Netherlands. If you'd have been interested in this sort of thing, he was out here in New Zealand. I spoke and listened to him for an hour and a half. And a chap who then looked at our New Zealand proposed laws and thought, wow, they are so safe and restrictive compared to the rather liberal laws existing there. So don't be telling me about how our New Zealand law doesn't have safeties, because that's nonsense.
Let's bring it closer to home, Stuart, in terms of...
I wish you would, finally.
Well, I will.
Let's
go back to Victoria and Australia, where one of the things there is that the doctors, that they have specialists in the conditions that the patient is dying who are reviewing things and looking at them. Here, the psychiatrist is only going to be bothered if there's a question of competence, it's not going to be about whether the patient is depressed or suicidal. From the New Zealand Journal of Pain Symptom Management, we know from a study of cancer patients near end of life that 60 to 70% of them also had concomitant depressive illness.
Okay,
What a surprise.
last word to Rod.
So why
and
wouldn't
then-
you want them to get some treatment and some relief?
creepers.
Why do you want them to not be treated?
Because
Why
being
not?
terminally ill is pretty depressing, frankly. You wouldn't know about it yet, and I hope you don't actually get into this sort of position. But I don't want to face a gnarly end and have to face it because people like you want to stick your nose in my own
But for
choices.
these
Thank you.
patients not being able to have treatment that they might otherwise have that would lift their burden is to us as doctors terrible.
Okay, last word to Rod, if you don't mind. We'll take the break.
I
and then
think
we'll
the
come
other
back.
thing to bear in mind is that Justice Mallon, in her declaratory judgment recently, pointed out that the doctor who has to do this assisted dying has got to be working within their scope of practice.
Absolutely.
As yet, there is no scope of practice for assisted dying in New Zealand. The Medical Council have got to decide that, but her suggestion was that people who were well versed in end-of-life care would be the ones who would have to do this. So it isn't going to be any GP or a psychiatrist or whoever you present to. This has got to be somebody, like John says, they're well trained, but they're working within a scope of practice. So I don't know quite where we're going to find all of these doctors.
Well, that
to do
leads us to the very next point that we're going to make. So let's take a break and then let's talk about how doctors are feeling about it and how many doctors will be prepared to do it. And also, as we've discussed, the question of that slippery slope. It's 14 away from 8. News Talk ZB. All right, welcome back. It's coming up 11 away from 8 here on the euthanasia debate. We are about to discuss the slippery slope. This has been a concern for a lot of people. Where exactly does this lead? At the moment, of course, the legislation only allows people who have 6 months left to die to be able to choose euthanasia. But does it go any further than that? John, this is an argument that you'll hear time and time again. We start with this, we end up with all kinds of people being eligible for this. Are you concerned about that?
Look, there is no evidence of the slippery slope overseas in the countries that have used this. This is really strong legislation, some of the most restrictive in the world. And
but the fact that this is restrictive is a moot point when it comes to this, right? Because over time, the concern is it will be less and less restrictive.
So, you need to audit the process, and it's not going to suddenly open up to everybody that doesn't have terminal illness. It's been refined, and they've talked about some of the refinements they made in Australia. They've done the same in Canada, and over 20 plus years in the European countries.
20 plus years in Oregon, which is a similar law to ours, with 6 months prognosis for terminal illness. So that's probably the closest. And for 20 years, there's no slippery slope. So, you can scaremonger all you like, but in reality, it doesn't happen.
It's absolutely not
in Belgium,
yeah.
the assisted suicide is going up 27% each year recently. So the number is rising in Belgium. And I do work with colleagues in Belgium, and I have asked them why that is. And their answer is, we've become socialized into believing that it's okay. So it's no longer the odd person who's doing it, who's choosing it. It's not small numbers anymore. It's becoming...
They are small numbers in comparison.
Well,
they're not big numbers at all.
What are we talking?
It's still 1 in 10 of people with cancer who end up having assisted dying.
So, I've got a good friend that's a GP in the Netherlands. He's practiced for 30 years, and he's been involved in assisted dying for one of his patients. It's still not, I can't give you the exact numbers. It's still not very common. And these people are suffering, and they want choice about how they end their life, and they have information from competent doctors that know about the situation and can talk them through. And that's what you do in medicine. You give people choice and then let them make choices about their health.
I would come back to the point about Oregon, and you're saying it's very similar to us. It absolutely is not, because in Oregon it's assisted suicide only. You are not requiring doctors to stand there and actually bring the patient's life to an end.
Similar in the fact that they have a 6 months terminal prognosis. That's all I said. So
sure.
Please don't misquote me.
But coming back to Oregon and other countries, anywhere that the legislation has been allowed, we actually see that the criteria do extend, as is logical. It's a logical progression.
Yeah, so give us an example of that, please, Mary, straight off the top of your head.
Any of the legislations that you can look at.
Belgium
and the Netherlands, Canada, they've got bills in their house for the mentally ill, for children.
In the use of end-of-life choice and medical-assisted dying as at the same time they've seen a reduction in suicides. You know, the traumatic suicides in this country.
So between 5 and 10%.
No, but
5 and 10% of suicides between 19.
Why are you saying that in Canada there are not bills in their house trying to extend their legislation to the mentally unwell and to children who have very
to be honest, I just don't care about all of these other little associations you want to make.
Well,
I want to argue the law in New Zealand.
And you've got
this
relatives,
is the most,
you want to know.
the most examined through parliamentary process law, arguably in the history of our laws in New Zealand.
But the question from Heather was, is the slippery
three
slope
different processes.
likely?
It's
and
been
the answer
through
is yes.
sign-off from the Attorney General.
Yes.
It's been through such an exhaustive process. Do you not trust that? I do.
Stuart, can I ask you a question, though? At the very outset of this legislation, did it not also include people with disabilities?
This was discussed, and I think reasonably so, when you see how miserably some poor folks suffer. And I think John is probably
people with motor neuron disease, people with multiple sclerosis.
And so, doesn't that indicate to you that the author of the bill had intended for it to have a wider scope than it does now, and thus that opens it to the possibility that may happen?
It's been, some might say it's been watered down to in some areas to make it, more palatable, and some people have had to, come off those lists. I think in other countries,
politically expedient was all it was, because to get something through like this, which people, it's been denied, for decades. This is a fourth attempt, to get this through. So in pure politics. So yes, unfortunately, those people that are going to suffer miserably with things like motor neuron disease, it's awful. They are going to miss out, and I feel sorry for those people. I really do.
And I just want to ask you two, Mary and Rod, about something. Do you think that you have been entirely fair about this when you, and I will come to you on this, Mary, when you discuss the coercion of the elderly, as if the elderly are somehow vulnerable here? This is about people who are dying within the next 6 months, right? This is not about this is not about knocking off your granny, is it?
But actually,
no, it's not about knocking off your granny. But prognosis, we can talk about prognosis. How good are doctors at prognosis?
Well, how good are they?
Well, on average, they get 20% right.
Absolutely.
20%. 15% of diagnosis is wrong. So are we confident about, firstly, the diagnosis? I've discharged people from hospices who've had terminal diagnoses. And when we've examined things more closely, they haven't had a terminal illness.
So I speak to oncologists, and they don't say you've got 6 months to live, and that's kind of anecdotal and not true. They'll give it, there's a bell-shaped curve of likelihood, and they tend to be pretty correct on these.
No, they don't.
No, they're not.
If you look at Nick Christakis' work in the New England Journal of Medicine, he's demonstrated that they're right 20% of the time.
It doesn't matter, actually, because the point that is salient here is that the individual still has the choice within that 6 month period to be well. I want to. If I can make it 5 months and 29 or 30 days within that 6 month prognosis of death, I'm going to bloody do it. I'm going to scramble and get as much as I can. And if I want to say no at the end of that time, still I can. It's about my choice. Sorry about that.
That's right.
Keep your nose out of my business, please.
Terminal illness, irreversible decline, and unbearable suffering. So when you get the diagnosis of your pancreatic cancer, you tend not to have that. Okay.
So what you're saying is you are going to be quite well down the path.
Again, in Australia, you don't need to do it at that time, and you make the choice, and then it.
Isn't that a fair point to make, Mary? That you might get the prognosis, but it might be months later when you are really, really crook. That
well, what seems to happen where this is allowed is that it might be months and months, but what some people are doing is they're actually stopping their medication. If you're a diabetic with advanced damage to your body, to your organs, all you have to do is stop your insulin, and then you're in the zone. But let's come back to the coercion side of things. Let's not forget that in New Zealand, for patients over the age of 65, 1 in 10 of those patients will have suffered some form of coercion, and it's either going to be physical or psychological and financial. In this time where people are, there's not enough housing, the elderly grandma's insurance policy and her home and her mortgage are very well. It's very real. It's a very real problem.
This is a straight out religious
We're talking about.
It's a crock of old crab apples, and you know it.
70,000.
You are misrepresenting the ability of New Zealanders to make this choice.
We have to have balances and protection for these vulnerable people.
The most restrictive
and religion
law in the
isn't
world,
one of the criteria, but protecting people is vital, because we do not want to have
I
people
agree.
dying who
I
should
agree.
not
And
be
doctors
dying
want to protect
at the
people.
hands of doctors, and
All
that's
right.
one of our roles.
You guys, it's been absolutely wonderful to have you in the studio, and I say thank you to all of you. You've given us a lot to think about as we head into making this decision, and we will be making it from Saturday with early voting. So thank you to Stuart Armstrong, suffering from terminal cancer, Dr. Mary English, specialist GP from Wellington, Dr. John Bunning, emergency specialist at Waikato Hospital, got it right this time, and Professor Rod McCloud, clinical director at Hospice New Zealand.
Thanks.
Thank you so
Thank
much,
you
you guys.
for being
That's
here.
been
Thank you very
the
much.
euthanasia debate. Enjoy your evening. News Talk ZB.